The Holy Gospel according to Luke, the 14th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. When Jesus noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, "Give this person your place." And then in disgrace you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, "Friend, move up higher." Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Jesus said also to the one who had invited him, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
I never like being one who brags, but I guess when you're voted as the Platinum Choice Best Pastor in the Quad County area, I guess that means you're supposed to listen to me more. Except somewhere along this week, I heard someone say to me, well, you know, when you're at the top, the only way to go is down. So I guess this is the best y'all are going to get. Sorry. But really, there was a kind honor this week. Even though most of you who I talked to had no idea what this was or how anybody even voted for it. So we don't know who voted for this. But I know some of you came to that presentation night, and thanks for making that effort, even though we had no idea what was happening there. And congrats to so many of you who were also recognized for your work that you do in and around this community. I look forward to hearing your acceptance speeches, since we didn't get a chance to share those that night. But except, just as soon as we start to celebrate and maybe brag a little about these awards that say we're the best at something, Jesus, as always, speaks up and knocks us down a notch or two. So what did he say this morning? He said, "For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." Can't we just have nice things, Jesus, for a little bit? Well, okay, hear me out. Since that phrase comes at the end of this parable, where Jesus talks about people who are fighting over the seats of honor at a banquet, and the moral of the story is to take the lower seats first so that you can be invited up higher, maybe these awards are like the invitation to the higher seats at the banquet, right? Yeah, everyone who got them, let's say, they've all been humbly doing their work without the need of recognition, and these honors are meant to affirm that. Okay? Well, maybe Jesus had something deeper to share through this parable, which has maybe very little to do with those kinds of awards we're celebrating this week. Because there's a lot going on here in today's lesson. First, look at how this gospel passage starts today. We hear that on one occasion when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. That maybe you noticed as we were reading that we skipped a bunch of verses in the passage today. What we skipped was another story of Jesus healing someone on the Sabbath. You know how that goes. The religious leaders were getting grumpy because Jesus was healing. He was doing work on the Sabbath when clearly the law given by God was to rest on the Sabbath. So because Jesus had been committing such heresy, these religious leaders, as they were gathering for the meal, were watching him closely to see what he might do. And as expected, Jesus does it again. He heals someone on the Sabbath, and after arguing about it, the leaders were left speechless. So we skip over that part today because we dealt a lot with that situation last weekend here. So then we pick up with the rest of today's reading. When Jesus noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. So everyone is gathering for this meal after all the hubbub of this healing. And as they're coming to the table, apparently there's some jockeying going on with how people are choosing where they're going to sit. Luke doesn't describe this situation any further than that, so we're left wondering, what is actually happening? Are people verbally arguing over who gets to sit where? Are they pushing and shoving, literally fighting over the positions? Someone's sitting here, and so someone sits next to him and starts pushing them down the table? Or is it a case of someone just coming up to somebody who's already sitting there and giving them that look? You know that look. That look that exerts power over them so that they know that that ain't their seat and they have to get up and move. Well, no matter how it was actually happening, Jesus sees this as this teaching moment. So he says, when you are invited by someone to this wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invites both of you will come and say, no, you give this person your place, and then you're being disgraced, and you would take the lowest seat. Rather, when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place already, so that when the host comes, he could say, friend, move up higher, and then you'll be honored in the presence of all who are there with you. So notice something about this. Jesus isn't condemning how people are acting at that dinner table at that moment. He's not looking at the ones who are already sitting in the places of honor and saying, hey, come on, why don't you let these people have a chance to sit there? Go ahead, just go ahead and switch seats. That's a good boy. No, Jesus sees what's happening at the table in front of him. And as we hear, he then tells them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, Jesus goes on to describe. And what are you supposed to do? Be humble. Don't walk in thinking that you're more important than the others who are there. Don't look around the room with that quick judgment and think, oh, surely I've got more status than most everyone who's here. I deserve to sit near the host more than they do. No. Jesus says, for all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And that should be pretty familiar if we've been listening to anything Jesus has said before. Right? He says all kinds of things like that through the Gospels, right? The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Treat others like you want to be treated. Love your neighbor. It goes on and on and on. So this is not that surprising. But still, I think there's a word of warning. I think we need to be careful with this passage, because there's a lot of weight and a lot of baggage with the simple encouragement of be humble. Because some might hear the teaching of Jesus to be humble and think, oh, I could out-humble all y'all. Just watch me. Jesus is going to be so impressed with how humble I am, he's going to have no choice but to invite me to the head of the table. Just watch. Watch me. Right? Some whom Jesus encourages to be humble take it as a challenge. A task that needs to complete it so that they can earn that spot near the host. Where on the other hand, on the complete other side of the coin, some who hear Jesus' encouragement to be humble are ones who are already humble, or who find themselves at the outer reaches of the table. Those who wonder if Jesus even notices that they've shown up. Who think, I could never be humble enough, even if I try. But we hear in this story and in all of Jesus' teaching that those are exactly the people who Jesus says will be exalted. They don't need to hear the command to be humble. They instead need to hear that the good news shows them and tells them that there's a place at the table for them already. This is exactly the kind of parable Jesus tells in order to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, right? But I think there's even a bigger theme in this parable. Because it comes in this line of in this row of other teachings here in Luke's gospel. And we've been hearing in the past few chapters and all of these stories that we've been hearing for weeks on end that Jesus has been talking about something specifically. He's been pointing to something specifically, which is the kingdom of God. Story after story that we've heard for the past many weeks in worship have been showing us how God's kingdom is completely different from the ways of our world. That things in God's kingdom are upside down and inside out from what we normally expect. And this parable is yet another example of that. But to go even deeper, more specifically, Jesus mentions this wedding banquet. And when that's mentioned in the Gospels, it often refers to the feast at the end of time. A feast that has no end. A feast where we get to be with God forever. And as we hear, when that time comes, God will be watching for the ones who take the lowest place, because they will be the ones invited to the places of honor. So maybe that's the ultimate crux of this parable. Who do you put in front of you? In what ways do you take the humble route in this earthly world? How can our lives daily reflect the life of the kingdom? Are you inviting friends and family to your banquet? Or are you inviting, who did Jesus say? The poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Those are people who, in that day and age, were constantly overlooked. They were always told that they were a disgrace to God because of what was wrong with them. They were told they had no worth. They never found a place at the table. But here Jesus says that they are the ones that we should invite to our tables. And so I wondered who the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind people might be in our day. Who are the ones around us who are constantly overlooked? Who are the ones who are told that they are a disgrace? Who are the ones who are told or shown that they have no worth and who are never given a place at the table? Who are the ones whom we vilify or judge or ignore or imprison or condemn? Who are the strangers to whom we should show hospitality because, as the writer of Hebrews said, we could be entertaining angels without even knowing it? I bet we could name countless people who don't have that place at the table. I bet we could name countless people who could never repay a banquet invitation. Isn't it amazing how radical this love is that we find in God's kingdom? Isn't it amazing how abundant the grace of God is, not only in God's kingdom, but here in our world right now? Christ sets an example in this parable. It's through the humbleness of Christ that we can experience true exaltation. It's through the humbleness of ourselves that this world can experience love and hospitality and open seats at a table of welcome. And it's through all of that humbleness that we carry the hope of our own seat at the resurrection of the righteous. Thanks be to God.